Hello there, everyone. Tonight's story takes us deep into the heart of Victorian England, a time of lace, lamplight, and loss. We'll be exploring the Strange Obsession. Victorians had with photographing the dead, a practice both haunting and strangely beautiful. Before we begin today's video, I could really use your help. We've noticed the channel's reach has dipped a little, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, completely free, and it helps us carry on bringing you new and fascinating stories. Your support truly means the world to us, and together we can keep this channel growing. And don't forget to tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is there. It's always wonderful to see who's joining us from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, perhaps turn on a gentle fan for that soft background hum, and let's drift together into this quiet, curious corner of history. I was 23 years old when I first learnt to capture the dead. It was not what I had imagined when I apprenticed myself to Mr. Edmund Fairweather in the autumn of 1856. I had dreamt, as young men do, of immortalising beauty, of duchesses in their finery, of children with ribbons in their hair, of lovers pressed together beneath blossoming trees. I had not imagined the weight of a child's body in my arms, still warm from the mother's embrace, as I positioned her before the camera's unblinking eye. The studio stood on Regent Street, 3 floors above a milliner's shop. The windows faced north, as all proper photographic studios must, to capture that cool, even light that falls without shadow or sentiment. Mr. Fairweather had established his reputation photographing the aristocracy, but by the time I arrived, a country boy with ink-stained fingers and dreams larger than my modest inheritance, the trade had begun its quiet transformation. The living, you see, had grown accustomed to the camera. The novelty had faded, but the departed, they represented an untapped market, a final service that could be rendered to families whose grief had not yet found its proper expression. I remember the morning Mr. Fairweather explained it to me. We stood in the chemical room, that small chamber at the back of the studio, where the air hung thick with the bitter scent of collodion and silver nitrate. My hands were already stained brown from the developing solution, my fingernails rimmed with chemicals that would never quite wash clean. "The living blink," he said, adjusting the flame beneath a beaker of distilled water. "They fidget, they cannot hold still for the 8, 10, sometimes 15 seconds required for a proper exposure. But the departed," he paused, measuring out grains of silver with a tiny brass spoon. "They are the perfect subjects, they do not move, they do not complain, and the families, they pay well for such services, very well indeed." I must have looked uncertain, for he turned to me with that patient expression he reserved for my more naive questions. "Death comes to us all, Mr. Hastings. Would you deny a mother the only image she shall ever possess of her stillborn child? Would you refuse a widow the comfort of one final portrait beside her husband of 40 years? I could not answer. I was young then, and death had not yet taken anyone I truly loved. The first commission arrived on a Tuesday morning in November. I recall the date precisely, the 8th of November, 1856, because it was also the day I received word that my younger sister had safely delivered her first child, life and the final rest, arriving in my awareness within the same hour. Mrs. Catherine Ashworth came to us veiled in black crape, accompanied by her brother, a stern gentleman with military bearing who spoke in the clipped tones of one accustomed to being obeyed. They wished to have a photograph taken of Mrs. Ashworth's daughter, who had succumbed to scarlet fever 3 days prior. The child was 7 years old. "We wish her to appear as though sleeping," Mrs. Ashworth said, her voice barely audible through the layers of mourning veil. She was so beautiful when she slept. I would watch her for hours, listening to her breathe. The words hung in the studio's dusty air. Mr. Fairweather accepted the commission with solemn dignity, as though being entrusted with sacred relics. He quoted his fee, 3 guineas for a single carte de visite, 5 for a larger cabinet card, and the arrangements were made. The child would be brought to the studio the following morning, before the sun rose too high and spoilt the light. That night I could not sleep. I lay in my narrow bed in the boarding house on Marylebone Lane, listening to the carriages rattle past on the cobblestones below, and I wondered what I had agreed to. I had seen the departed before, of course. laid out in their coffins, hands folded peacefully, faces waxy and strange in the candlelight. But to touch them, to position them, to arrange their limbs for the camera's scrutiny, that was something altogether different. Would you have dared to take such a photograph? They arrived as the morning fog still clung to the street, transforming the gas lamps into dim, hovering orbs. The child came wrapped in a white sheet, carried in her father's arms. He was a tall man, hollow-eyed, who moved as though walking through deep water. Behind him came Mrs. Ashworth, still veiled, and the military brother, and a nurse who wept quietly into a handkerchief. Mr. Fairweather received them in the studio's anteroom, murmuring condolences in that soft, professional voice he had perfected. Then he turned to me. "Mr. Hastings, please prepare the posing room." I climbed the stairs to the third floor, where the largest windows admitted the clearest light. We had already arranged the scene the previous evening: a small upholstered chair, a table with a vase of white lilies, a backdrop painted to suggest a garden scene. It was Mr. Fairweather's belief that post-mortem photographs should convey peace, should offer the illusion of rest rather than the finality of the end. The father carried his daughter up the stairs himself, refusing all assistance. When he laid her on the chair, I saw her properly for the first time. She was a lovely child, with dark curls that framed a face of perfect stillness. Someone, the nurse perhaps, or the mother, had dressed her in a white gown with lace at the collar and cuffs. Her hands had been folded across her breast, and between her fingers they had placed a small posy of forget-me-nots, but her eyes were closed, the lids faintly purple, and her lips had taken on that peculiar greyish cast that no amount of powder could quite disguise. Mr. Fairweather worked quickly and efficiently. He positioned the child's head against the chair's cushioned back, adjusting the angle to catch the light most favourably. He arranged her hands more naturally, letting one rest in her lap whilst the other hung loosely at her side. He brushed her curls forward to hide the slight discoloration at her temples. I stood by with the head brace, that necessary tool of our trade, an iron stand that fitted behind the chair to hold the subject's head perfectly still during the long exposure. But Mr. Fairweather shook his head. "Not needed for this one," he murmured. The family watched from the doorway. The mother had lifted her veil now, and I could see her face, drawn, pale, aged a decade in the space of a week. She watched Mr. Fairweather's every movement with an intensity that was painful to witness. When all was arranged, Mr. Fairweather stepped back to study the composition. He made minute adjustments, tilting the child's head a fraction to the left, lifting her chin with 2 gentle fingers. Then he nodded to me. "Load the plate, Mr. Hastings." I'd prepared the glass plate that morning, coating it with collodion in the darkness of the chemical room, sensitising it in the silver bath, sliding it into its wooden holder whilst it was still wet and tacky. Now I carried it to the camera, that great mahogany box on its tripod stand, and slid the plate into position. Mr. Fairweather draped the focusing cloth over his head and peered through the ground glass at the back of the camera. For a long moment he stood motionless, studying the inverted image before him. Then he straightened. "It is ready." The mother stepped forward. Might I sit beside her? Just for the photograph." Mr. Fairweather hesitated. It was not uncommon for families to wish to be included in such portraits, but it complicated the exposure considerably. The mother would need to remain absolutely still, and grief had a way of making people restless. But he nodded. "Of course, madam. Mr. Hastings will assist you." I helped Mrs. Ashworth into position beside her daughter's chair. She settled herself on a low stool, and without prompting reached out to take the child's hand in her own. The gesture was so natural, so achingly tender, that I had to look away. Mr. Fairweather repositioned the camera, adjusted the focus, checked the light falling across both faces. Then he removed the lens cap. "Perfectly still now, if you please." The room fell into a silence so profound I could hear the hiss of the gas lamp in the corner, the distant rumble of an omnibus on the street below. Mrs. Ashworth sat motionless, her daughter's small hand clasped in hers, her eyes fixed on that sleeping face. The seconds stretched out, each one an eternity. 8 seconds, 10, 12. Mr. Fairweather replaced the lens cap. "Thank you, madam. That will do very well." Mrs. Ashworth did not move immediately. She continued to hold her daughter's hand, her thumb moving in a small, unconscious circle against the cold skin. Then, very slowly, she leant forward and pressed her lips to the child's forehead. "Sleep well, my darling," she whispered. "Sleep well." I carried the exposed plate down to the chemical room with hands that trembled slightly. In the amber glow of the safety lamp, I poured the developing solution over the glass and watched as the image began to emerge from the chemical fog. First vague shadows, then clearer forms, and finally the complete picture. The child in her white gown, peaceful and still, the mother beside her, her face a mask of such profound sorrow that it seemed to radiate from the glass itself. It was perfect. Every detail was sharp, every tone properly rendered. The whites of the gown and lilies glowed softly against the darker background. The child's face held that peculiar serenity that belongs only to those who have finished their earthly journey. But it was the mother's hand, clasped around her daughter's, that held the eye, that single point of contact between the living and the departed, preserved forever in silver and light. When I showed the photograph to Mr. Fairweather, he studied it for a long moment in silence. Then he nodded. "This is good work, Mr. Hastings. This is very good work indeed." The Ashworths collected their photographs 3 days later. 6 carte de visite prints mounted on cream card and 1 larger cabinet card in a gilt frame. Mrs. Ashworth wept when she saw them, but they were, I think, tears of gratitude rather than fresh grief. She held the framed photograph to her chest as though embracing the child herself. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for giving her back to me." But had we given the child back? Or had we merely captured the shell she had left behind, the empty vessel that had once held all a mother's love? That first photograph marked the beginning of my true apprenticeship. Over the following months and years, I learnt the peculiar art of photographing the departed, with all its strange rituals and unspoken rules. I learnt that infants and small children were posed in their mother's arms, or in cribs banked with flowers, or seated in small chairs with toys arranged nearby. They were dressed in christening gowns or their finest Sunday clothes, their hair carefully brushed, their faces powdered to hide the waxy pallor. Sometimes we propped their eyes open with small wires, or painted pupils onto the closed lids, so that they might seem to gaze at the camera. Other times we left them sleeping, peaceful, as though they might wake at any moment. I learnt that older children and young adults were often posed as though reading, or holding flowers, or with their hands folded in prayer. The girls wore white, always white, the colour of innocence and angels. The boys wore their school uniforms or dark suits, their hair pomaded flat, their collars starched and proper. I learnt that adults were more commonly photographed in their coffins, the lid propped open, flowers banked around them. But sometimes families requested that they be posed in their favourite chair, or standing with the aid of a special frame that supported them from behind, hidden by their clothes. These were the most disturbing commissions, the ones where we were asked to create the illusion of life from the evidence of its absence. I remember a young man, perhaps 25 years old, who had perished in a railway accident. His parents wished him photographed standing, dressed in his wedding suit. He had been engaged to be married the following month. We supported him with an iron frame, positioned his hands on the back of a chair, tilted his head at what we hoped was a natural angle. His eyes we left closed. There was no disguising what had been lost. But his mother, when she saw the photograph, wept with something that might have been joy. "He looks so handsome," she said, "so handsome and strong, just as he would have looked on his wedding day." What do you think the departed might feel about being immortalized in this way? The question haunted me then, and haunts me still. Did we honor them, or did we violate them? Did we preserve their memory, or did we trap them in a moment of transition, neither fully gone nor fully present? I had no answers. I only knew that the commissions kept coming, and that each one required us to perform our strange alchemy, transforming the final rest into an image that could be held, framed, cherished. By 1858, post-mortem photography had become so commonplace that most studios offered it as a standard service. The newspapers carried advertisements, portraits of deceased persons taken at short notice. the departed photographed with artistic sensibility. Preserve the memory of your loved ones in permanent form. Mr. Fairweather's reputation grew. We were known for our discretion, our sensitivity, our ability to render the departed not as grotesque reminders of mortality, but as peaceful sleepers who had merely closed their eyes for a time. We photographed infants who had lived but hours. We photographed children taken by diphtheria, scarlet fever, cholera, whooping cough. We photographed young mothers who had perished in childbirth, often posed with the infants who had survived them. We photographed old men and women who had reached the end of their allotted span, their faces lined and peaceful, their hands folded over prayer books or Bibles. Each photograph was unique. Each one told its own small story of loss. But they all shared that same quality, that peculiar stillness that separated them from photographs of the living. It was not merely that the subjects did not breathe or blink. It was something deeper, more fundamental, an absence that the camera captured with merciless accuracy. The living, even when holding perfectly still, possess a quality of potential motion. One senses that they might at any moment shift or smile or turn their heads, but the departed have finished moving. They have arrived at their final position, and there they shall remain until the grave claims them. The camera knows this, the camera sees it, and the camera records it, in every subtle shadow and telling detail. I think often of something Mr. Fairweather said to me during those early years. We had just completed a particularly difficult session. A young woman who had taken her own life, whose family wished to remember her as she had been before despair claimed her. We had worked for hours to position her naturally, to hide the marks that sorrow had left, to create an image of peace where peace had been notably absent. As we packed away the equipment, Mr. Fairweather paused and looked at me with those steady grey eyes of his. "We are not merely photographers, Mr. Hastings," he said. "We are sculptors of memory. We take the raw material of grief and loss, and we shape it into something that can be borne, something that can be looked upon without flinching. We give families not truth, but comfort, and sometimes that is the greater kindness." I did not entirely agree with him then, and I'm not certain I agree with him now, here at the end of my own road, but I understood what he meant. The truth of the final rest is often unbearable. The body's surrender, its transformation from living flesh to empty matter. This is too horrible to contemplate directly, too absolute to accept. But a photograph, carefully composed, properly lit, respectfully rendered, that can be looked upon, that can be cherished, that can be shown to friends and family as evidence that the departed was real, was loved, was mourned. In 1861, something occurred that would transform our trade entirely. Prince Albert, the beloved consort of Queen Victoria, succumbed to typhoid fever on the 14th of December. He was 42 years old. The nation plunged into mourning. Black crape appeared in every window, on every door. The shops closed, the theatres went dark, and the Queen withdrew into a grief so profound that it seemed to consume her entirely. She had photographs taken of the prince on his final resting place, lying in state, his hands folded, his face peaceful. She commissioned paintings based on these photographs. She had his rooms at Windsor Castle preserved exactly as he had left them, with fresh clothes laid out each day, hot water brought each morning, as though he might return at any moment. She wore mourning for the remainder of her life, 40 years of unrelieved black, of crepe and jet, of widowhood worn as a badge of eternal devotion. The Queen's grief gave permission to the nation to grieve publicly, extravagantly, permanently. Mourning became not merely a duty but an art form, complete with its own elaborate rituals and requirements, and post-mortem photography flourished. Suddenly, it was not merely acceptable but fashionable to have photographs taken of one's departed loved ones. The practice spread from the middle classes to the aristocracy, from London to the provinces, from England to the farthest reaches of the empire. Studios specialised in such work. Photographers advertised their expertise in rendering the departed with taste and sensitivity. Catalogues offered special frames, albums, lockets designed to hold these precious images. Mr. Fairweather's business doubled, then tripled. We hired additional assistants. We opened a second studio in Kensington. We could barely keep pace with the demand. I was 28 years old, and I'd photographed more of the departed than I had of the living. The work changed me, though I did not recognize it at the time. I became intimately familiar with the textures and temperatures of the final rest. I could judge by sight alone how long a body had lain unattended. I knew which cosmetics best concealed discoloration, which poses suggested peaceful slumber, which angles minimized the evidence of suffering. I learnt to manage grieving families with professional sympathy, to soothe their anxieties, to understand their wishes, to gently guide them towards compositions that would photograph well while still honouring their emotional needs. I learnt to work quickly, for the departed do not keep indefinitely, particularly in summer. Many times we were summoned to private homes to photograph someone who could not be moved, who must be captured where they lay. I would arrive with my portable equipment, camera, tripod, plates, chemicals, and transform a bedroom or parlour into a temporary studio, working around the family's grief to create the image they desired. And I learnt to separate myself from the work, to view each commission as a technical challenge rather than a human tragedy. This was necessary for my sanity, you understand. One cannot carry the weight of so much sorrow without finding some means to distance oneself from it. But the cost of that distance was considerable. I remember a particular afternoon in the spring of 1863. We had been commissioned to photograph an entire family, father, mother, and 3 children, who had perished in a house fire. The bodies had been badly damaged, but the family's relatives wished to have some memorial, some final portrait to mark their existence. We did what we could. We posed them as though sleeping, arranged them as a family group, hid the worst of the damage with careful positioning and strategic lighting. We worked for hours in the hired chapel where the bodies lay, breathing the scent of smoke and burnt flesh and the lilies that someone had placed everywhere in a futile attempt to mask the truth. When we finished, I walked out into the spring sunshine and discovered that I felt nothing. Not horror, not disgust, not even pity. Only a mild satisfaction at having completed a difficult technical assignment. That evening I returned to my lodgings and sat at my window, watching the sun set over the rooftops of London, and I realised that something had been lost. Some essential sensitivity had been burned away by the constant proximity to the final rest. I could no longer see the departed as people. They had become, to me, merely subjects, compositions to be arranged, exposures to be calculated, images to be captured. This frightened me more than anything I had yet encountered in my work. I considered leaving the profession. I considered returning to my father's estate in Hertfordshire, taking up the quiet life of a country gentleman, putting aside the camera and all its morbid applications. But I did not leave. I remained, and I continued my work, and I told myself that it was necessary, that it served a purpose, that it brought comfort to those who grieved. And perhaps it did. Perhaps it does still. But I wonder sometimes what price I paid for that service. What part of myself I surrendered to the glass plates and chemical baths, to the endless parade of the departed, who passed before my lens. In 1864, I photographed my first true love. Her name was Elizabeth Thornton, and she was the daughter of a respected physician in Bloomsbury. I'd met her 2 years earlier at a dinner party, and had been immediately captivated by her wit, her intelligence, her passionate interest in the new sciences. She was 24 years old, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, determined to make something of her life beyond the narrow confines society prescribed for women. We courted in the modern fashion, walks in Regent's Park, visits to galleries and lectures, long conversations about photography and medicine, and the future that seemed to stretch before us, bright with possibility. I had intended to ask her father's permission to marry her that summer, but in May she complained of a headache. By June, she could barely rise from her bed. The physicians came and went, prescribing this tonic and that treatment, but nothing helped. The affliction tightened its grip day by day, until she was no longer the vibrant, laughing woman I loved, but a pale shadow confined to a darkened room. She passed on the 18th of July with her family around her, and with me holding her hand. Her father, who knew my profession, asked if I would photograph her. The request was made kindly, gently, with full understanding of what it meant, but it was made nonetheless. I wanted to refuse. I wanted to tell him that I could not, that this was too much, that there were limits even to professional duty. but Elizabeth had told me in one of our last conversations that she was grateful for my work. "You give people something precious," she had whispered, her voice weak but her words clear. "You give them a way to hold on just a little longer. Don't despise yourself for that kindness." And so I agreed. I photographed Elizabeth in her parents' drawing room, laid out on a daybed beneath a window that let in the soft afternoon light. She wore her favourite dress, a pale blue silk that brought out the colour of her eyes, though her eyes were closed now and would not open again. Her dark hair had been arranged on the pillow, and someone had woven white roses through it. Her mother wished to be included in the photograph. She sat beside the daybed, one hand resting on Elizabeth's folded hands, her face composed but her eyes red from weeping. I set up my camera with hands that barely trembled. I had done this hundreds of times before. I knew every step, every adjustment, every technical requirement. This was simply another commission, another exposure, another image to be captured and developed and printed. But when I looked through the camera's ground glass at the inverted image, Elizabeth lying there, so still, so silent, her mother beside her, I felt something crack inside my chest. I took the photograph, I developed the plate, I made the prints, and then I locked myself in my rooms for 3 days and wept until I had no tears remaining. The photograph of Elizabeth sits on my desk as I write these words, more than 40 years later. She looks peaceful in death, beautiful even, with that ethereal quality that the camera sometimes captures in the newly departed. Her mother's hand on hers speaks of love and loss and the terrible weight of survival. It is a good photograph, technically speaking. The exposure is correct, the focus sharp, the composition balanced. By all professional standards, it is a success. But every time I look at it, I see not a photograph but an absence. Not Elizabeth as she was, but the empty space where Elizabeth should have been. Not life captured, but life irretrievably lost. This, I think, is the terrible secret of post-mortem photography. We claim to preserve memory, to offer comfort, to provide a lasting memorial. But what we truly create is evidence of loss. Each photograph is a testament to absence, a permanent record of the moment when someone ceased to be. The living can be photographed again and again, their images accumulating like layers of sediment. But the departed can only be photographed once, at that singular moment when they hover between the world they have left and whatever lies beyond. And that single image must bear the entire weight of remembrance. After Elizabeth's passing, my relationship with my work changed fundamentally. I could no longer maintain the professional distance I had so carefully cultivated. Every body I photographed became Elizabeth. Every grieving mother reminded me of Mrs. Thornton, sitting beside her daughter's daybed, with tears streaming down her face. Every father's quiet dignity recalled Dr. Thornton's painful request. The work did not become easier with this renewed empathy. If anything, it became harder. But it also became more meaningful. I began to see the departed not as subjects, but as people, as individuals who had lived and loved and laughed and wept, who had left behind the evidence of their existence in the memories of those who mourned them. And I began to understand that what we did, Mr. Fairweather and I, and all the photographers who engaged in this strange trade, was not merely technical work, but sacred duty. We were the keepers of final moments, the recorders of last images, the preservers of faces that would otherwise fade from memory entirely. By the 1870s, post-mortem photography had evolved significantly. The technology had improved. Faster emulsions allowed for shorter exposures, which meant we could capture more natural poses. The wet collodion process gave way to dry plates, which were easier to manage and produced finer detail. But more importantly, the aesthetic had shifted. The early stiffness and formality gave way to more intimate, personal compositions. Families wanted their loved ones photographed not merely as peaceful sleepers, but as themselves, surrounded by their favourite things, in their accustomed places, as they had been in life. I photographed a musician with his violin, a gardener in her conservatory, surrounded by blooms, a scholar in his library, his hand resting on an open book, a child with her beloved doll clutched to her chest. These photographs felt different from the earlier work. They spoke not of the final rest itself, but of the life that had preceded it. They were portraits in the truest sense, capturing something essential about the person who had passed, preserving not merely their appearance but their character. In 1875, Mr. Fairweather retired. He was 71 years old, and his hands had developed a tremor that made the precise work of photography increasingly difficult. He sold the studio to me for a remarkably modest sum, and retired to Brighton, where he took long walks along the sea and never touched a camera again. I was 42 years old, and suddenly I was the master of my own establishment. I hired assistants, as Mr. Fairweather had hired me. I taught them the technical skills, the professional demeanour, the delicate balance between efficiency and empathy that our trade required. But I also taught them something that Mr. Fairweather had not explicitly taught me, though perhaps I had learnt it anyway, that every person we photographed was someone's entire world, that the images we created would be looked upon for generations, would become the only physical evidence that this person had existed, had mattered, had been loved. Never forget, I told my assistants, that you are handling not merely bodies but memories. Treat them accordingly. The trade continued to flourish through the 1880s. Queen Victoria's prolonged mourning had established a culture of remembrance that showed no signs of abating. The middle classes, aping their betters, embraced elaborate mourning rituals. Black crepe and jet jewellery became ubiquitous. Mourning cards, mourning stationery, mourning photographs all became essential accessories of respectable grief. But even as the practice thrived, I began to notice a subtle shift in public sentiment. The new generation, those who had grown up with photography as a commonplace rather than a marvel, seemed less enthusiastic about post-mortem portraits. They found them morbid, unsettling, even ghoulish. Why would one wish to remember the departed as they were in passing? A young woman asked me once when she came to collect photographs of her grandmother. Why not remember them as they were in life? I had no good answer for her, or rather, I had too many answers, accumulated over decades of work, none of them entirely satisfactory. Because sometimes the final rest is the only time we have to capture an image. Because grief demands expression and ritual. Because photographs, unlike memories, do not fade or distort with time. Because holding an image of the departed is better than holding nothing at all. But these answers felt inadequate in the face of her question. Perhaps, I thought, the practice was finally reaching its natural end. Perhaps the next generation would find other ways to remember, other means of preserving memory. I was not entirely sorry at the prospect. By the 1890s, my hair had gone grey and my eyes required spectacles for close work. The studio that had once seemed so vital, so necessary, began to feel like a relic of a fading era. Fewer families came for post-mortem photographs. Those who did were often older people, clinging to the traditions of their youth. The younger photographers in London spoke dismissively of the practice. Victorian sentimentality, they called it, morbid obsession with the final rest. They preferred to photograph the living, society events, theatrical productions, sporting matches. They wanted their art to celebrate life, not memorialise its absence. I could not entirely blame them. In 1897, I photographed what would be my final post-mortem portrait. The commission came from an elderly woman, Mrs. Grace Pemberton, who wished to have a photograph taken of her husband of 63 years. He had passed the previous day, peacefully in his sleep. We were married in 1834, she told me, sitting in my studio with her gnarled hands folded in her lap. Before photography, before railways, before telegrams, we have seen so much change, he and I. But one thing has not changed, my love for him, and I would have one final image, one last portrait to remember him by. I agreed, of course. How could I refuse? I went to their home in Marylebone, a modest house filled with the accumulation of 60 years of marriage, paintings and photographs, books and mementos, furniture worn smooth by long use. Mr. Pemberton lay in their bedroom, dressed in his Sunday clothes, his face peaceful and dignified in the final rest. Mrs. Pemberton wished to be included in the photograph. She sat beside her husband's bed, holding his hand just as she must have held it countless times during their long marriage. And as I prepared my camera, as I focused the lens and loaded the plate, she spoke to him softly, telling him about the weather, about the flowers blooming in their small garden, about the grandchildren who would come for tea on Sunday. She spoke to him as though he could hear her. Perhaps, in some way, he could. I took the photograph. The exposure lasted 10 seconds. 10 seconds of perfect stillness, of silence broken only by the ticking of a clock in the hallway and Mrs. Pemberton's gentle murmuring. When I removed the lens cap, Mrs. Pemberton looked up at me with eyes that had seen 7 decades of life, of joy and sorrow, of birth and the final rest. "Thank you, young man," she said. "You have given me a great gift." I was 64 years old. No one had called me young man in many years. I developed that final plate with particular care, making multiple prints, ensuring that every detail was rendered perfectly. The photograph shows an elderly man at rest, peaceful and dignified, and beside him an elderly woman whose love radiates from her face like light from a lamp. It is, I think, the finest post-mortem photograph I ever took. Not because of its technical merits, though those are sound, but because it captures something essential about love and loss and the long accumulation of years together. Mrs. Pemberton collected the photographs a week later. She wept when she saw them, but smiled through her tears. "There we are," she said, touching the print gently. "There we are, together, one last time." 6 months later, I received word that Mrs. Pemberton had passed. I hope that she was laid to rest beside her husband, with that photograph nearby. I closed the studio in 1899. The new century was approaching, and I had no wish to carry the old practices into it. My assistants found positions elsewhere easily enough. There was always demand for skilled photographers, though not for our particular speciality. I sold the equipment, packed away my plates and prints, and retired to a small house in Hampstead, where I spend my days tending a modest garden and writing these memories. I have not photographed anyone, living or departed, in more than 25 years, but I still dream sometimes of that long parade of faces I captured over 4 decades, the infants in their mothers' arms, the children in their white gowns, the young men and women taken too soon, the elderly who had reached their natural span, the families grouped together for one final portrait. They visit me in my sleep, those faces, not threatening or accusing, but simply present, waiting patiently for me to remember them, to bear witness to the lives they lived and the losses they represented. And I do remember them, every single one. People sometimes ask me, now, whether I think we were right to photograph the departed as we did, whether the practice was ghoulish or comforting, morbid or meaningful. I have no certain answer. I only know that we did what was asked of us, what families needed from us. We gave them images to hold when they could hold nothing else. We gave them proof that their loved ones had existed, had been real, had been worthy of remembrance. Whether that was enough, whether it was right, whether it truly brought comfort or merely prolonged grief. These are questions I cannot answer. I can only tell you what I saw, what I did, what I preserved in silver and light during those strange years when we tried to capture the moment between life and the final rest. I can tell you that every photograph was a small act of resistance against oblivion, that every image preserved was a victory, however temporary, over the erasure that time inevitably brings. The departed do not remain with us, no matter how tightly we hold their photographs, but the photographs remain, and in them something persists. Not the person themselves, perhaps, but the evidence of their passage through this world, the proof that they were loved, that they were mourned, that their absence left a wound that photographs could not heal, but might, perhaps, make bearable. I am 89 years old now, and I feel the weight of all those years pressing upon me. My hands shake with palsy. My eyes, even with spectacles, struggle to focus on the words I write. I know that my own final rest approaches, that soon I shall join that long parade of faces I photographed so many years ago, and I wonder sometimes whether anyone will photograph me when my time comes, whether anyone will wish to preserve my image in that final moment, to capture the shell I leave behind as evidence that I existed. I think not. The practice has faded entirely now, relegated to the curiosities of Victorian sentimentality. The new century has brought new ways of remembering, new technologies that allow us to capture motion and sound, to preserve the living rather than memorialize the departed. This is perhaps for the best. The world moves forward, and old customs must give way to new ones. But I confess that I shall miss it, in some strange way. That peculiar intimacy that came from standing before the camera with someone who had finished their earthly journey. That moment of absolute stillness when the shutter opened and time itself seemed to pause, allowing us to capture something that existed between memory and loss, between presence and absence. There was a kind of honesty to those photographs that I rarely see in modern portraiture. The living hide themselves, consciously or not. They present the face they wish the world to see, the version of themselves they have carefully constructed. But the departed cannot dissemble. They are revealed in their final vulnerability, stripped of all pretense and protection, and yet, in that vulnerability, there was often a strange dignity, as though, having surrendered everything else, they had achieved a kind of peace that the living can only imagine. I think of Mrs. Ashworth, holding her daughter's cold hand for those final 12 seconds of exposure. I think of Elizabeth, lying in her blue silk dress with roses in her hair. I think of Mrs. Pemberton, speaking gently to her husband of 63 years as though he might respond, as though the conversation that had sustained them through a lifetime might continue beyond its natural end. These moments were sacred in their way, not in any religious sense. I make no claims about what lies beyond this life, but sacred in their absolute sincerity. In those moments, grief was pure and undisguised. Love was naked and unashamed. And we, the photographers, were privileged witnesses to these private extremities of human feeling. Would you have taken such photographs? If you had lived in my time, would you have found the courage to stand before the camera with the departed, to arrange their limbs and adjust their poses, to count out the seconds whilst families held their breath and their tears? Or would you have turned away, unable to bear the weight of so much sorrow, so much loss? I do not judge either choice. The work was not for everyone. It required a particular temperament, steady hands and a steadier heart, the ability to maintain composure in the face of grief, the willingness to touch the departed without flinching or fear. But it also required something else, something harder to define, a belief perhaps that what we did mattered, that these images we created served some purpose beyond mere commerce or custom, that in capturing these final portraits we were performing a necessary service, preserving something precious that would otherwise be lost entirely. I believed that once with the certainty of youth. I am less certain now, here at the end of my own road. But I do not regret the work I did, the photographs I took, the families I served. Each image was a small monument to love and loss. Each photograph was evidence that someone had been here, had been real, had been worthy of remembrance, and if that was all we achieved, if our work did nothing more than provide proof of existence, evidence of love, then perhaps it was enough. The light is fading now, both in this room and in my eyes. I shall not write much longer. My hand grows tired, and the words come more slowly than they once did. But before I finish, I want to tell you about the last photograph I keep beside me, here in my small house in Hampstead. It is not a post-mortem portrait, though it resembles one in its composition and tone. It is a photograph of myself, taken by one of my former assistants some 15 years ago. I'm seated in my garden, surrounded by roses, my hands folded in my lap. The exposure lasted 8 seconds, and during those 8 seconds I held perfectly still, as I had taught so many others to do. When I look at this photograph now, I see a man who has lived too long and seen too much. I see the weight of decades in my face, the accumulation of all those hours spent with the departed, all those moments captured and preserved. I see someone who has stood at the boundary between life and the final rest so many times that he has become, in some sense, a permanent resident of that liminal space. But I also see something else. I see a man who did his work with care and dignity, who tried, in his limited way, to serve those who grieved, who preserved what could be preserved, even knowing that preservation itself is temporary, that even photographs fade and silver tarnishes and paper crumbles to dust. I look at this photograph and I think, this is how I shall be remembered, if I'm remembered at all. Not in motion or speech, not in the full vitality of life, but in this moment of perfect stillness, frozen in time, preserved in silver and light, captured forever in that space between presence and absence. It seems fitting somehow. I spent my life photographing the departed. It is only just that my own image should possess something of that same quality, that I should become, in the end, what I spent so many years observing. The camera sees all and judges nothing. It records what is placed before it, with perfect impartiality. It does not distinguish between the living and the departed, between joy and sorrow, between the moment before the final rest and the moment after. It simply captures light, preserves shadow, fixes the fleeting instant in permanent form. This was our gift and our burden, we photographers of the departed. We could not restore what was lost. We could not heal grief or reverse the passage of time. We could only bear witness, preserve evidence, create small monuments to love and loss. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps it is always enough to simply bear witness, to say, this person existed. They were loved. They were mourned. Their absence left a wound in the world that nothing could heal. The photographs remain. Long after the families who commissioned them have themselves passed, long after the studios that created them have closed, long after the photographers who took them have been forgotten, the photographs remain. Silent witnesses to a practice that seems strange and morbid to modern sensibilities, but which served a purpose in its time. Evidence of an age when the final rest was not hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes, but was part of daily life. When families laid out their departed in their own homes, when children were taught to view the passing not as something to be feared or avoided, but as a natural conclusion to every life. We live differently now. We hide the final rest away, speak of it in euphemisms, pretend that it might not come for us if we refuse to acknowledge its existence. But it comes nonetheless. It comes for us all, in its appointed time. And when it comes for me, as it shall very soon now, I wonder whether I shall welcome it as an old friend, familiar after so many years of proximity, whether I shall greet the final rest with the same peaceful acceptance I saw in so many of the faces I photographed, or whether, at the last, I shall cling to life with the same desperate intensity as those who commissioned portraits of their departed, trying to hold fast to what cannot be held, to preserve what cannot be preserved. I do not know. I cannot know until the moment arrives. But I am not afraid. I have stood too long in the presence of the final rest to fear it now. I have touched too many cold hands, arranged too many still limbs, looked into too many unseeing eyes, to believe that there is anything truly terrible in that final passage. The departed were peaceful, most of them. Whatever pain or fear they had known in life, whatever struggles they had endured, all that was finished. What remained was only stillness, only silence, only the empty vessel that had once held a living soul. And if that is what awaits me, that perfect stillness, that absolute silence, then I can accept it. I can lay down my burden and rest, knowing that I did my work as well as I was able. The photographs will remain. They always remain. Long after I am gone, someone may come across the images I created. They will look at those Victorian portraits, those stiff formal compositions, those strange memorials to a practice they cannot quite understand. And they will see what I saw, what I preserved, evidence of love, proof of grief, testimony to the universal human need to remember, to hold on, to resist. If only for a moment, if only in an image, the inexorable passage of time and the finality of loss. They may find it morbid. They may find it disturbing. They may shake their heads at Victorian sentimentality and wonder how we could bear to photograph the departed as we did. But perhaps, just perhaps, they will also understand. They will understand that we did not photograph the final rest because we were obsessed with mortality, but because we were desperate to preserve something of life, that we captured those still faces and folded hands not to celebrate the end, but to commemorate everything that had come before. Each photograph was a memorial, not to passing itself, but to existence. Each image said, this person lived. They breathed and laughed and wept. They were loved. And when they finished their earthly journey, someone cared enough to preserve their image, to create a lasting record of their passage through this world. That is what we did, we photographers of the departed. We bore witness, we preserved memory, we created monuments to love and loss, grief and remembrance, and if, in doing so, we sometimes created images that were strange or unsettling, that captured more than we intended, or revealed more than we realized, well, that was the nature of photography itself. The camera sees all. It records everything placed before its unblinking eye, the truth beneath the surface, the reality behind the carefully constructed pose. We tried to create comfort. We tried to bring peace. We tried to give families something to hold when everything else had slipped through their fingers. Whether we succeeded or failed, each person must judge for themselves. I can only tell you what I did, what I saw, what I preserved during those long years, when I stood between the living and the departed, the camera in my hands and grief all around me. I took the photographs, I developed the plates, I made the prints, and now, at the end of my own road, I lay down my pen. The light has faded, the words are finished. All that remains are the photographs themselves, silent, enduring, bearing witness to a practice that has passed into history, to an age that shall not come again. Let them speak for themselves, those images I created. Let them tell their own stories of love and loss, grief and remembrance, life and the final rest. I've said all that I can say. The rest is silence, and in that silence, perhaps, lies the truest memorial of all. Not the images we captured, but the lives they represented. Not the photographs themselves, but the love that caused them to be taken in the first place. Remember that when you look upon those Victorian portraits. Remember that behind each stiff pose and formal composition, behind each carefully arranged scene and calculated exposure, there was love, there was grief, there was the desperate human need to hold on just a little longer to what could not be held. We were not monsters, we photographers of the departed. We were not ghouls delighting in mortality. We were simply people doing our best to serve other people in their darkest hours, to give them something precious, to preserve what could be preserved. And if we succeeded, if we gave comfort, if we eased grief, if we created images that allowed families to remember their loved ones with love rather than horror, then our work was worthwhile. The photographs remain, and in them something persists. Not life, perhaps, but the evidence of life. The proof that someone was here, was real, was loved, and that in the end is all any of us can hope for. To be remembered, to be loved, to leave behind some small evidence of our passage through this brief, beautiful, terrible world. The camera captured it all, the light and the shadow, the living and the departed, the moment between presence and absence, and I, standing behind the lens, bore witness to it all. This is my testimony. This is my memorial. These are the photographs I took, the memories I preserved, the moments I captured during those strange years when we tried to hold fast to what could not be held. May they rest in peace, all those faces I photographed. May they rest in peace, and may we who survive them find our own peace in time. The light fades, the exposure ends, the image is fixed forever, and I, having played my part in this long drama of love and loss, prepare to take my own place before the camera. One final portrait, one last image, and then, at last, the perfect stillness I have observed so many times in others. The rest is silence, the rest is peace. The rest is the final photograph waiting to be taken.